Hi everyone, this is Miss Braxton and I'm coming to you with some notes on judicial activism versus judicial restraint, which hopefully will help you as we go through our moot court simulation and as you try to figure out where exactly your justice lies. So take a moment to read this quote from Fed 78. Says the judiciary has no influence over either the sword or the purse. It may truly be said to have neither force nor will, but merely judgment. Fun fact, Fed 78 is all about the judiciary, and this is one of your required documents. So you can think about these questions. What is Hamilton saying about the function of the judicial branch? And what does he imply are not the functions of the judicial branch? We can think about the sword as being the executive branch because we know that they have the power to really enforce those laws that are made. We know that the purse is a power of the legislative branch and they have the power to spend money where they see fit. And so it's saying that, the judiciary has neither force nor will, merely judgment. So you can think about what he's really trying to say about what the function of the judicial branch should be and what it should not be. It all comes kind of back to this question about how should laws be interpreted, which we know is a huge, maybe the most important function of the Supreme Court. And these are the questions that they often think about. Should we follow the literal word of the law? Should we follow the intent of the law? Should we follow what we think founding fathers intended, or should we change with the time? And these are the things that you're going to have to think about. These are the things that Supreme Court justices think about, and it's what guides their decisions as they are looking at the law and looking at the Constitution and trying to figure out what the best, most fair, most accurate judging should be. So there's this ongoing debate about how should the Constitution be interpreted. The first kind of way that you can think about is this idea of a strict constructionist. So judges who follow this philosophy are bound by the wording of the Constitution. This means that basically if it's not written in the Constitution, then they're really not going to follow it. We call this typically judicial restraint, which means that the role of the court is somewhat restrained because it is restrained within the confines of what is actually written in the Constitution. On the other side, we have loose constructionists, and these are judges who look at the underlying principles of the Constitution. So not necessarily the literal words, but what is the spirit of the Constitution? And because they're not confined in the same way that strict constructionists are, typically they're following judicial activism, which is where the justices are able to, or where the courts at least, are able to take a more active role in changing things. Because whereas judicial restraint is following, this idea of we're going to restrain ourselves unless it's in the Constitution. Loose constructionists don't need to do that. So they're taking a much more active role in the way that they interpret the Constitution. So something that's really important to remember is that it's not a matter of liberal versus conservative justices, and it's not definitely not a matter of, Democrats versus Republicans, because a judge can be both conservative and activist or liberal and a strict constructionist. So when we're thinking about this, it really is this philosophy that is behind their decisions, not necessarily their political ideology. That being said, we can today draw some lines between activists being more liberal and strict constructionists being more conservative. So people who follow strict constructionist judicial restraint, those tend to be the judges that we think of as being more conservative. And then those loose constructionist judges who follow typically judicial activism, we can sometimes draw lines most of the time between them being those justices who we would consider to be more liberal. But it is important to note that they are not always mutually exclusive. Let's talk a little bit more about judicial activism. So this again is this idea that courts need to take a more active role in society's problems, that the courts are kind of like this guardian of the people. And when the executive and the legislative branches can't make things more equitable, that courts should be upholding this. And that courts should be correcting these injustices that are ignored or even sometimes perpetuated by other branches. For example, if the legislative branch passes a law, for example, that is segregating students in schools, that is an injustice that is perpetuated by the law itself. And therefore, the courts should step in and correct that. And again, judicial activists tend to view the Constitution as a living document. They are loose constructionists, right? They are the people who are feeling that the Constitution is a living, breathing document, that it should change as the times change, and that the Constitution actually does give broader powers to the federal government than what may actually be physically written there. And you can take some time to think about what some pros and cons of judicial activism might be. On the other hand, we have judicial restraint, which encourages justices to limit the exercise of their own power. So this means that justices should really be staying within the confines of what the courts can do. A lot of times you'll hear people who practice judicial restraint arguing that judicial activism is legislating from the bench, right? It's not up to the courts to write laws. It is up to courts to be this kind of impartial entity that is going to be limited, again, by the confines of what is in the Constitution. And again, it's saying that justices really shouldn't be striking down laws unless they are obviously unconstitutional, and that lawmakers are people who have been elected by the people, and therefore lawmakers are going to typically be making laws that people want them to make. Justices are not elected by the people, and therefore they should not be striking down laws left and right that are made by elected officials unless they are clearly, obviously unconstitutional based on what is the written word of the Constitution. And again, they believe that typically states or these other two branches should solve and handle social problems or economic problems and political problems, that it's not up to the courts to handle those issues. And often they suggest that the court should follow the original intent of the founders. So basically, if the founders wouldn't want it, the justices shouldn't do it. Again, they're following that the word of the Constitution, not just the word of the Constitution, but how they think the founders, what they think the intent of the founders was when they wrote it. And again, you can think of this as the opposite of judicial activism and think of some pros and cons of judicial restraint. And again, this is just kind of reiterating some of the last things we said about, the literal meaning of the Constitution. We're only going to strike it down if it's clearly unconstitutional. And also this idea that judges should be immune to public opinion, that public opinion is wishy-washy, and the Constitution itself is a timeless document and should be less fluid than public opinion. So judges should be immune to that and be very cautious as they interpret the Constitution and showing that restraint. You can choose to watch this video. I do suggest you watch it. However, I'm not going to play it now. And if you are in class, you'll be having a discussion about this as well. But I'm hoping that now you have a better idea of judicial activism, judicial restraint, the difference between the two, and how they are not quite the same as liberal versus conservative or Republican versus Democrat, but they really are their own judicial philosophies that you should be thinking about as you make your rulings and as you research your justices for moot court. Thanks, guys. Feel free to reach out to your teacher with any additional questions.